A volume could be written about the impressions I got from the would-be writers in that class, and I dare say that any student of culture could draw a great deal of information on the local population just based on how I was featured in the stories I would hear when they were eventually read at the start of the next class. However, while I did request and receive copies from those who wrote to feature me in their one-shot short stories, which I eventually released in a short compendium to my larger volumes of studies on humans, this is not the place you will find them. Some of my colleagues, one of whom would prove quite vexing in time when we finally met, would be particularly critical of withholding those stories from this particular volume. However, instead the choice was mine, and I made it. Class came and went, and I parted ways with Lisa as quickly as we began. I worked that day and filled out idle paperwork in between the arduous task of ordering the local unit's database of documents and information into something sensible. Truth be told, nothing of note, even by my standards, happened that day, which is why I gloss over it to cover the next day of class, and where I and the others read their brief stories out loud. Those same critics would level their clucking tongues and accusing fingers at me for including a fraction of my own work where I excluded the others, but I assure you this is justified. Our plump but energetic teacher leveled her pudgy finger at me and said my name. "Bailey, you may read now." To my eternal gratitude, I was the last to go, and so I had time to brace myself mentally. I told myself over and over, just treat it like your doctoral presentation. It's just like that, just practice. I tried not to be nervous, though my tail drooped a little, and a mortifying awe came from somewhere in the tiny sea of faces when that became obvious. But I did my best. She stepped aside, nodded encouragingly, and left the podium to me. At that moment, I recalled the way Fauve stood in front of hundreds of adults, and I wondered with awe that any human, any creature, could be that brave. All I could be was just me, which at that moment didn't feel like very much at all. I lowered my head and looked down at my datapad, cleared my throat, and read. My story is titled, If Only, by Bailey Walker. I do my best, and I am so tired. She won't sleep, she won't cooperate. If only I had time for me. If only they knew how much I loved them. If only they knew how much I cared. Wouldn't they return the same to me? If only they knew. Would they dare? The warmth of the sweets that I give them, and the warmth of the sweets I consume. I will spare you the rest of my awful first attempt at a fictional work. I had written the short story in poetry form, which was meant to show the frustration of a single mother who ate sweets to feel something good while feeling unappreciated in her home. I felt the long, quiet stare of my teacher a little too much for my liking, and when I stopped reading my short page, it was several lengthy seconds which felt like minutes, before at last our teacher said, very good first effort. Not very action-oriented, but very emotive. Still, try to flex your creative muscles a little. Fiction can be anything. You could have her flee from it all by jumping into space on a pogo stick, or an alien shows up and sweeps her off her feet, or she develops superpowers and suddenly everything is easy, only it leaves her unfulfilled now that there's no challenges left. Do anything, and the less real it is, the more it can touch the audience. The best familiar in fiction is far removed from reality, but still also touches home in just the right ways. She gave me a very fragile smile. I'd seen it before, on Fauve, William, and Rebecca, when they were sure they should smile, but weren't sure they could keep it up. She knew. Humans are a disturbingly perceptive species in some ways. In a way, I failed. If I had made it more outlandish, she wouldn't have seen who it was about, but I was so focused on the details. Talk about an error. After class, Lisa seemed to notice my distress, and she gave the fur on my arm a little tug. "Coffee?" she asked. "Work starts in an hour," I told her, and she tugged my fur again. "Coffee is 5 minutes away and work is 7 on a scooter." "So, coffee?" she asked, and tilted her head up at me with a playful smile that was really more of a taunt. She leaned forward a little and tilted her head up so that the autumn leaf design of her hair swayed a little. I do not know why, but I have a hard time saying no when these humans ask me to do things. I rubbed the back of my head, my ears flopped down and my tail wagged a little. Yeah, sure," I said and began to walk beside her. The buildings may have been largely square or rectangular, but the University of Louisville seemed to love to make the interiors round for some reason, with open corridors and each level able to look down on the one below it. I drew some funny looks and some surprised ones too, but those I could blow off. But from a very small number of human males, I drew looks of outright hostility. Their glowers were matched by the brief baring of teeth, but none approached me, and Lisa seemed not to notice them. Another of my kind might have been confused, but I was not. I knew that despite the help of Percival, there were still those out there who were convinced all aliens were a threat, and from my own casual browsing in weak moments, I knew that some awful things were said of how I related to my human family. That didn't linger on my mind for long, however, as we made our way downstairs in short order and stood in line at a small counter while Lisa fiddled on her datapad. "There, order placed," she said, and stowed it in her backpack. "You what now?" I asked. "I ordered for us both, don't worry, this one is on me." She said, "You grab us a table, I've got nowhere to be until practice, and you've got nowhere to be till work, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't get our table early." She pointed out it was an efficient argument that no Dlamisa could resist. Yeah, sure." I agreed, and looked to the side area where out of dozens of tables, only 2 or 3 remained open. The hubbub of chatter wasn't that bad, despite the little crowd. It reminded me of the bar on the ship that brought me to Earth in the first place. Now here I was again with yet another Lisa, who was seemingly just as charming. "I still have that liquor she gave me." I thought it over and licked my lips. No, save it for a special occasion," I told myself. But before I thought too much about that, my new Lisa sat down across from me. The table was round, small, and just perfect for 2, and she asked me abruptly, "What's up?" "Nothing," I protested. "You don't have to say," she said, and slid the thick paper cup over to me. The hot, steaming liquid drifted up to taunt my nose with the scent of that wonderful, rich, dark bean. "But," she took a sip of her cup, "William did tell me you're a terrible liar." "A lot of things," I admitted. Deception, it seems, was not my greatest skill. "You don't have to say," she repeated herself. "But nobody here is listening. Well, except for me." She pointed to herself with one finger. "And besides, you want to be focused for your job here in a little while, right?" The threat to my efficiency loomed large in my mind, and I went over how the weight of my deadline for an experiment loomed larger every day, how I was upset that I made Fauve worry she'd done something wrong, and how I screwed up that assignment by making it obvious to the teacher that she was the subject. Lisa remained quiet through it all, and herein I must add, one of the humans' finest strengths is their capacity for empathy. From a scientific standpoint, it simply refers to the capacity to learn by observation, to understand the motives of others. It is part of why humans undergo a prolonged period of maturation and learning before they grow to adulthood. But this hyper-empathetic trait was so powerful that this human I barely knew not only managed to identify that I was disturbed, but able to get me to talk about it. Empathy, in this regard, is not only the capacity to understand, but also to care. Their ability to connect thought and feeling, action and decision, is far superior to any other predatory species I have ever encountered. It made me wonder how it is that humans, with this hyper-empathetic trait, were ever able to take the lives of their fellow men. I resolved to make a study of human war culture and history later, but in that moment it was just a wave of relief washing over me to vent to someone who would listen and reassure me that it wasn't as bad as I thought. That, however, was interrupted by the buzzing of my datapad. "Just one moment," I said, and Lisa sipped quietly on her coffee while I pulled out the pad and unlocked it. "Oh, this is unexpected," I said as I read through the message. "What's that?" Lisa asked. She leaned forward over the table as if to look at the tablet for herself. "The merchant vessel, the one I'm supposed to handle, they got slingshotted by a rogue star passing through space that greatly increased their speed and, well, they're going to be here in a few days." "Is that bad?" Lisa asked. "I don't know. Based on what this says, they heard about bourbon, whiskey, and various other things. And with them being ahead of schedule, plus with the probable damage to the ship from the slingshot maneuver, do you think Louisville has enough liquor to keep a cargo ship full of really drunk Dlamacin merchant sailors happy once they find out what the stuff is like?" I had my doubts about that, but Lisa seemed not to, as she only reached out, tapped the black tip of my nose and said, "Challenge accepted." I should have known better than to ask a human if something like that could be handled. I really should have. But to my credit, I knew a mischievous look when I saw it at least. "You're thinking of something, aren't you?" I asked, and Lisa nodded. She was wiggling in her chair with the kind of excitement I didn't often see even out of humans, but that I've at least seen in fiction, and recognized that it meant she was anticipating something. Lisa didn't speak right away. She had her datapad out and was typing something. A moment later, there was a ding noise back, then more typing, then more dings. I pulled the face. The cocked, curious look that made humans seem to melt and made them talkative. A bunch of your guys' sailors are heading here, right? Space Marines? Space Doggos? Merchant Space Doggo Marines? Whatever, yeah? She asked, clearly trying not to keep her smile from getting larger. Yes. I drew out my answer. I kind of had a feeling I knew where this was going. So, like, you're on the football team now? And you work for the little army office here. What say we get everybody together for a good time? A little goodwill exchange. They're going to get some shore leave, right? Not just hang out at the space dock, she asked. But she already knew the answer. Louisville had always been a transportation hub, and it wasn't uncommon for shuttles or ships to land on the outskirts of the city. Maybe we could introduce them to some human sports, arts, and how we kind of cut loose, and they could show us what they do when they need to unwind. It'd be fun, and after that nasty business recently, you know, a little goodwill couldn't hurt. It was a more tentative tone out of her than I expected, but I could see she was hooked on the idea. It was at this point that the seed of an idea that had taken root before began to break through the soil of my mind and blossom. I'll talk to the ambassador. We've been here for a bit and I have to go to work, but thanks for listening. Have a good day. I know I spoke more rapidly than I normally did, that it probably looked like I was blowing her off, but the truth was far different. Academic vigor was taking hold in me like fire through dry grass. Looking back even hours later, I might have hurt her feelings a little, but I am Dlamison, my work, my task. I was honed in on it. I began typing out a proposal with pros and cons, intending to send a concept draft to Professor Sislith before I even reached my place of business. In the first edition of this publicly released journal, I did not include the concept document. However, due to popular request for the sake of the historical record, as I have the only remaining copy, I will enclose it below. Professor Sexlith, proposal. A study in interspecies team dynamics between Dlamison Space Marines, Earth military units, and Earth sports teams. Hypothesis. Different species may bond effectively through cooperative competition. Plan of action. Introduce a sport with which the teams have no prior experience, but which athletic figures are capable of engaging in. For our purposes, I will introduce each of the 3 groups to Ballyball, and then pit them against each other. Variables will include team shifts, rewards, and the introduction of alcoholic beverages. As we change dynamics and levels of social inhibition, I predict the teams will gel into one unified whole across each variable. Justification. It is paramount to the peace of the galaxy that species learn to work cooperatively, not only in spite of their differences but because of them. Understanding our respective strengths and weaknesses will allow us all to come together in a common peace. Species justification. Humans and Dlamisons are available in sufficient numbers for observation, are both evolved from apex predatory races, but also clash in the wide gulf of cultures from which we come. If humans and Dlamisa can come together, then any species can. It was crude, but it was also a matter of urgency. I knew I could clean it up later. As I zipped along the path on my scooter, racing toward my workplace, I drafted a spoken message to be delivered over the global net. Professor, at your earliest hasty convenience, I urge you to check the proposal I've just dispatched. I apologize for the crudity involved, but variables have changed and approval will be needed soon, before the arrival of the freighter. I will get approval from the local military. I'll go through Byron if I have to. Please get back to me as soon as you've granted approval and I'll let you know my budget by tonight. I hung up the call. He hadn't answered. That wasn't shocking to me. The professor had a lot of students to mind here on Earth, and at least one of us caused all manner of havoc. My arrival at my workplace came minutes later, and I walked in 15 minutes before my day was to begin. I have to admit, the human military had quite an appeal to me. They were quiet and businesslike. I sat at my desk and began sorting through files and linking data, and went uninterrupted for 2 straight hours. It was only when I heard the telltale ding on my datapad that I stopped my work and pulled it out of my pocket to check. Clothing may not have been necessary on my world, but it was hard to deny the practicality of wearing things with built-in carriers. My finger trembled when I went to my datapad screen and unlocked it with my telltale squiggle pattern. All three of my hearts were pounding in my chest, like I was in the crosshairs of a Zenti pirate vessel all over again. If he doesn't approve this? I felt my air sac seize up. I pictured myself trudging, walking down the long corridor of the entry station, the walkers going with me. Fauve would hug me, I was sure. I think they all would have. Michael, given time, would forget me, painlessly, easily, until I was just this faint, vague memory of a figure he used to play with. Fauve? She would grow up, grow older. I'd be able to correspond with her, and in time she would be all right. Human children are adaptable, and we could write to one another at least. And we probably would, for a few years at least, until her adulthood and her own life took her away from keeping in touch. Then we too would drift apart. William and Rebecca, they would age and pass away before I could even hope to return, and that is if I didn't have to take a human colony posting. I had very little chance of ever seeing my humans again if this did not go well. Even if he approved it, even if he was on my side, this was what humans call a long shot. But it was the only shot I had.